Yeah, right.
We're going to start, since I know many of you have to leave right at the end of the lecture, because I've already heard that from several people. My name is Sandy Morgan, and on behalf of the Rock Ethics Institute, I welcome you to the second in a series of lectures in a series called Social Justice and the Economy, National and International Perspectives. Nancy Tawana, the director of the Rock Institute, usually does this job, but she had to be out of town today, so I was given the privilege of welcoming you very warmly and thanking you for being here. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the introducer, but I do have to do my job and thank the many co-sponsors of this event, the Richard and Ronnie Lippen, the Africana Research Center, the Department of African and African American Studies, the Department of Labor Studies and Employment Relations, the Department of Psychology, Sociology, Women's Studies, and the University Library. And the Rock Institute has a major endowment from Doug and Julie Rock that undergirds all of our programs, so we thank them as well. I'm also going to point out, and I'm going to put on that table posters for this lecture series. If you don't have one on your door already, please grab one on the way out so that you can help us advertise them. And I want to particularly ask you to join us on October 30th, same time, same place. Dr. Amina Mama, the Chair of Gender Studies at the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town, will be giving the next lecture, and it's really one not to miss. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Grace Hampton, who's the head of the Department of African and African American Studies, someone who has had more appointments in this university over the years than most people I've met so far, and a professor in integrative arts. And I thank her for doing the honors of introducing our speaker today.
Thank you very much. These are my notes, and I compared that to what Dr. Veney had in her hand, and it's about half the size. But I promise you, it won't be that long. It is my pleasure to introduce a friend and a colleague, Dr. Cassandra Veney, who is a speaker for this afternoon. Dr. Veney holds a joint appointment as an assistant professor in the departments of African and African American Studies and Women's Studies here at the Pennsylvania State University. She's held that position since her arrival in September of 2003. Dr. Veney received the PhD in political science from the University of Missouri at Columbia, the Master's of Arts in African Studies from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and the Bachelor of Arts degree from Syracuse University in New York. Although I have her file in my office, I thought I would see what information could be found through a Google search. There were over 20 pages which contained her name, with over 120 descriptions of her publications, participation in professional meetings, and references to her publications by other scholars. Although her latest work focuses on East Africa, Dr. Veney's work is worldwide in its scope. For example, along with Dr. Richard Payne, from Illinois State in Normal, Dr. Veney published an important article titled Taiwan and Africa, Taipei's Continuing Search for Internationalism in the Journal of African and African American Studies in 2001. She is also the co-author of 2 books, Leisure in Urban Africa and Women in African Studies, and she has just completed a book entitled Forced Migration in Eastern Africa, Structural Adjustment, Democratization, and Refugees, which is in press as we speak at the Palgrave Macmillan Press. In fact, I searched for that as well, and it is already on Amazon. And now, let us give Dr. Veney a round of applause as she comes for her presentation this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so very much, Dr. Hampton. Is the dean here? Because I'm telling you, that introduction makes it seem like I'm definitely ready for tenure. The title of my presentation is The Racial and Gender Dimensions of Being Foreign in America. There is a vast array of scholarship on immigration in the United States, and as of late, more scholarship that examines immigrants of color, especially African and Caribbean immigrants. I noticed that a lot of the research is focused on comparing these two immigrant communities with the historic African American community in terms of looking at health, education, participation in the labor force, marriage, and assimilation, with most of the conclusions determining that both groups are faring better than those African Americans who are descendants of the 4 million slaves set free in 1865. In sum, it's almost as if there's a concerted effort on the part of the academic community to further other the African American community and to point out its deficiencies and pathologies all over again. For example, on one hand, J.G. Reed and M.O. Emerson's article entitled Racial Context, Black Immigration and U.S. Black-White Health Disparity concludes, and I quote, compared to U.S.-born blacks, black immigrants from minority white, Africa, South Africa, and racially mixed West Indian regions have superior health. They further state that, and I quote, "The few existing studies indicate that black immigrants on average have better health than native-born black Americans," end of quote, in terms of having lower rates of hypertension and obesity. On the other hand, their research indicates that the longer black immigrants remained in the United States, the worse their health becomes, and Emerson states that, quote, their health advantage erodes as they and their children begin to suffer the consequences of being black in America, end of quote. What these studies and others offer us is the reality that the historic African American community, African, Caribbean, and other immigrant communities of color have more commonalities than differences. And instead of pointing out what the real or perceived advantages that one group has over the other, more scholarship needs to be devoted to how the various communities can come together to build viable, sustainable coalitions that put issues of social justice, human rights, and equality on the minds of policymakers, the media, students, and ordinary Americans. Now, I hope you are well rested and you didn't have a heavy lunch, because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, I don't have colors for you, I just have me. And I just found out I can't read from there as I thought I could, so I have to put this up here. This talk has three goals. First, it will briefly provide a starting point of when and why more immigrants of color began to enter the United States. Second, it will examine various public policies prior to September 11 and examine how they affected immigrant and refugee men, women, and children. Third, it will examine those same policies following 9/11 in an effort to make the case that the current war on terrorism is not new, it did not begin after September 11th, and it is not just directed at Middle Eastern, South Asian, and North African immigrants. In doing so, I will attempt to provide a racial and gender analysis of what it means to be foreign in pre-9/11 America and post-9/11 America. Prior to the September 11th terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the airplane in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, U.S. domestic and foreign policymakers, the media, and the American public have been preoccupied with identifying, apprehending, rounding up, detaining, and deporting those who are deemed to be foreign, alien, undocumented, and illegal in our quest to win the war on terrorism. Those in the foreign category could even include legal, documented residents. We see this as early as 1996 with the passage of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, signed into law by none other than former President Clinton, which allowed for the detention and deportation of legal immigrants with green cards if they were convicted of offenses that included shoplifting, assault, vandalism, and tax evasion. It is interesting to note that 1996 ushered in the era of welfare reform, demonstrated by the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, also signed into law by Clinton. The clampdown on immigrants, both legal and illegal, coincided with the new war on poverty that focused on the welfare queen, read African American and Latina women. In addition, the war on drugs was still being mounted against communities of color that included immigrant communities with African American, African, Caribbean, Latin American, and Asian residents. Developments concerning anti-immigration in the post-9/11 phase were simply a continuation of those prior to 9/11. On one hand, the war on terrorism has targeted people who have their origins in the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa. On the other hand, September 11th is directly connected to the increased interest, frustration, and efforts to make our borders safe. Read the Mexican border. From the hordes of aliens who sneak across or attempt to cross the border illegally on a daily basis. I think of this as the Paco Maria syndrome, where illegal immigration, therefore aliens, are constantly portrayed as Mexicans without taking into consideration not only are there other nationals who enter the country illegally, but thousands of Mexicans enter the country legally. Does anyone even consider the thousands of Canadians, Irish, Poles, English, Germans, Russians, Bulgarians, Ukrainians, read white, who enter the country without proper documentation, or who enter legally but overstay their visas and then become illegal? And still, there are thousands of black migrants, and I know this is not the right term, but I'm putting everybody into the black migrant category because I didn't have the time, or I didn't come up with a new term. And still there are thousands of black migrants from the Caribbean, and some of those places, of course, include Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and Trinidad. Black migrants also come from South America, Guyana, and they could be of African descent or they could be of East Indian descent, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and of course there are black immigrants who come from Europe and Canada. And of course there are thousands of black immigrants who are really African, but I put them into that category. Asian immigrants come from all over. Some of the places, of course, include China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Burma, Korea, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, and other countries, who somehow also elude officials and enter the country illegally, or they initially entered with the proper documentation but let their visas expire. The catalyst that forced me to begin to think more seriously about the issues of immigrants in the United States was Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath. Because yes, as Dr. Hampton stated, most of my research has looked at refugees, particularly in East Africa and Kenya and Tanzania in particular. We all witnessed those very frightened people turning coolers, car tires, and whatever else they could get their hands on into flotation devices, while others huddled on the rooftops waiting to be saved. Still others remained holed up, and I got that from Bush talking about bin Laden, holed up and addicts finally cutting or shooting their way out when the water levels rose too high, threatening to end their lives. I knew I had to do something when I had former students emailing me, upset, former students emailing you, can you imagine? Upset that the media had portrayed the survivors as refugees. As Henry Giroux points out in his article titled, Reading Hurricane Katrina, Race, Class, and the Biopolitics of Disposability, and I'm quoting here, cries of desperation and help were redefined as pleas of refugees, a designation that suggested an alien population lacking both citizenship and legal rights had inhabited the Gulf Coast, end of quote. This demonstrates that they had more in common with immigrants of color, as both groups were defined as foreign and alien. Even the media could not distinguish between a person who has crossed an international border and is outside of her country of birth or habitual residence, and one who may not be safe but has remained in her country of origin and who is merely internally displaced. In other words, it was as if they had been stripped of their citizenship. This is understandable in the cases of Kenneth Kaunda, the first president of Zambia, who was accused of being Malawian and not Zambian. Immigrants from Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire, who some politicians and others claim are not citizens. And Tutsis in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who some have argued have no ancestral claim to the land and therefore are foreigners and should go back to Rwanda. That's okay. We can wrap our brains around that. And I'm being sarcastic. But after all, this was America, and these were Americans. How could this possibly happen? The racial dimension of the whole thing was too glaring to ignore. And it made me think that if we cannot comprehend our own people, what would be the reason for understanding, comprehending, and accepting those who are deemed to be foreign, and could they be awarded social justice if they were not even considered American citizens? Moreover, Katrina evacuees were being resettled in some states and cities where African Americans, refugees, and immigrants of color reside, where the war on poverty, where the war on drugs, where the war on terrorism was still being waged. Some of those places, of course, include New York, Miami, Houston, Phoenix, Denver, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago, and various urban centers in New Jersey and other states. These communities were marginalized, invisible, filled with disposable people, neglected by the government and our own American version of structural adjustment, where the national government has basically been rolled back in terms of providing quality, and I have this in quote, because these things are being provided, whether they're quality or not, is a horse of another color. Quality education, health care, job training, and other social services to the needy, refugees, immigrants, the elderly, youth, people who have mental and physical challenges, and women, whether they are working, single, divorced, unskilled, are married or unmarried, have children or don't have children. Let's turn our attention now to the social justice of immigration reform. There are many commentators, academics, and policymakers who are quick to point out how immigration has and will negatively affect African Americans in terms of jobs, housing, affirmative action, and social services, and how African Americans harbor anti-immigrant sentiments. What they fail to recognize and acknowledge is the role of African Americans in immigration reform legislation, which is situated within the context of gains made by African Americans as part of the civil rights movement, and how these gains were translated into political demands for more equitable immigration and refugee policies that allow thousands of previously excluded immigrants to come to the United States. The civil rights movement was not just to bring about equality, freedom, democracy, and social justice for African Americans, with a long history of human rights violations and terrorist attacks by the government and private citizens. Gains of the movement were intended to be inclusive. Therefore, when more African Americans were elected to Congress as a result of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the creation of majority-minority districts, these legislatures used their positions on various House, because there weren't any in the Senate except one lone one in Massachusetts. So they were using their positions in various House committees and subcommittees to advocate fairer immigration policies. The 1980 Refugee Act, supported by the Congressional Black Caucus, allowed for the admission of more refugees from Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean who fled from civil war, political violence, and human rights abuses, but their numbers were not equal to those coming from Southeast Asia and later the former Soviet Union, its Eastern European bloc, Iran, and Cuba. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which has its critics, was also supported by the Congressional Black Caucus in terms of allowing undocumented immigrants to regularize their status and to remain in the country. I think it is important to point out that women who were members of the Congressional Black Caucus were in favor of the legislation in terms of legalizing the status of men and women immigrants in order that they could remain in the country and to take care of their families both here and abroad. Trans-Africa, the Congressional Black Caucus, the NAACP, and ordinary African Americans kept up with events in El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Ethiopia, Somalia, and other hot spots during the 1980s, and did not necessarily view the admissions of these immigrants and refugees as displacing them from their homes, communities, and jobs. Now let's turn our attention to immigration policies in the pre-9/11 era. How did we get from immigration policies that were not perfect, but were beginning to become more inclusive in the 1960s, to current policies that are blatantly racist and sexist and harken back to a bygone era? First, it is important for us to fundamentally understand that the decision to let people into the country legally and then give them the opportunity to regularize their status means to regularize their stay means that they can eventually become citizens. And citizenship has always been gendered and racialized in this country because it is viewed as a privilege. It was never intended to confer equality nor eradicate the racial and gender hierarchy that continues to plague America. We all know that citizenship was first granted to white males who owned property. Later, it was extended to white women, and then to Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos. And I'm not listing any of them in any particular order. And let us not forget how American-born white women lost their citizenship through congressional acts by marrying a foreigner. This was an effort to maintain the racial and gender hierarchy by punishing women who married foreign men who were unable to become citizens. This was because a woman took on the citizenship or immigrant status of her husband along with his ethnicity. If he were a citizen, she would not lose hers. If he were not or could not become a citizen through naturalization, read Africans, people of Mexican descent, any other men of color, who of course could not become citizens through naturalization because you had a nasty little law on the book called the 1790 Naturalization Act that stayed on the book, of course, until after World War II with the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act. Leslie Orloff argues convincingly, and I quote, "Early United States immigration law incorporated the concept of coverture, which was a legislative enactment of the common law theory that the husband is head of the household. Under it, the very being or legal existence of the woman was suspended." How you doing? During the marriage, you getting a little sleepy out there? During the marriage, or at least incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything, end of quote. Immigration scholar Timothy H. Edgar argues that, quote, "Immigrants in the United States face greater challenges than ever, and not only as a result of an unfortunate backlash against immigrants after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Even before those attacks, immigrants in the United States were suffering the effects of punitive anti-immigration legislation passed in 1996, before 9/11. The onslaught on the rights of citizens, illegals, legals, and the undocumented began in the pre-9/11 era with three particular pieces of legislation. First, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act made it more difficult for legal immigrants to remain in the country after initially they were denied federal welfare benefits that included supplemental security income, food stamps, Medicaid, temporary assistance for needy families, child health insurance, and public housing. This piece of legislation was particularly harmful for women immigrants in violent, abusive relationships and marriages who were often dependent on their male partners for sponsorship. It is well documented in the literature that immigrant households are viewed as being headed by men, and wives and children obtain their sponsorship through them. Many women remain in abusive partnerships because they fear they will be deported or they will be unable to adjust their status. Welfare reform legislation that targeted immigrant women has served to keep women in some abusive relationships. The legislation made an exception for immigrant women who were battered and could prove that their battering is linked to their need for public assistance, which has made this provision fairly useless as more and more immigrants, even those with documentation, are reluctant to avail themselves to any U.S. authorities in fear that they will be deported. The same can be said for immigrant women who were supposed to benefit from the other piece of legislation I'm going to talk about too, Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Battered immigrant women were allowed access to public benefits that included housing, WIC, Women and Infant and Children, temporary assistance to needy families, Medicaid, school lunch programs, and food banks. However, given the anti-immigrant sentiment and crackdown against aliens, and I have this in quote, in the country, many immigrant women were afraid to ask for help, which meant that their children and other dependents suffered as they struggled to secure food, health care, housing, job training, and language skills. Those who were undocumented were not entitled to receive any benefits under the new legislation initially. The gender and racial dimension of the legislation cannot be ignored. We know that the American targets of the legislation were primarily African American women. The welfare reform were primarily African American women who were viewed as lazy, unwilling to work, and having too many babies out of wedlock, followed by Latinas, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and white women. The foreign targets of the legislation were women who, according to Timothy H. Edgar, and I quote, are far more likely than their male counterparts to receive public assistance, end of quote. These foreign targets were Mexican, Filipino, Guatemalan, El Salvadorian, Haitian, Dominican, and others, women. Again, we don't see the white immigrants who receive welfare benefits, either from the Caribbean, Cubans, or from Europe and Canada. Some of the people in this category, of course, were disabled, some were pregnant, some had just given birth, some were underage, some were elderly, taking care of small children and elderly members, and sick family members, or simply were unable to secure employment, or the employment was not enough to meet the individual and family needs. If any white immigrant men received benefits, we did not see them in the media, nor did I come across any when I was doing the research for this presentation. Now let's look at the detention of immigrants. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act may have allowed battered immigrant women to receive benefits, but it wreaked havoc in other areas of their lives, along with the third piece of legislation, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. It's a very interesting name, isn't it? The American Friends Service and other pro-immigrant groups reported that this legislation, and I quote, dramatically expanded the number of deportable offenses, established harsh federal criminal penalties for immigration violations, subjected immigrants, even legal permanent residents, to deportation for relatively minor offenses, even if they were committed in the past. So the long arm of the law could certainly come back and haunt you and detain you and to eventually deport you. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act produced an explosive increase in the number of people incarcerated in detention facilities, prompting the INS, which was the INS back then, to lease space in county jails and private detention facilities around the country. For example, due to these two pieces of legislation, there were 5,532 people in INS detention in 1994. This number shot up dramatically. In FY 2001, we saw 19,533 people in detention. Not only are more and more people in detention, but their stays are getting longer and longer. And many of the people in detention are men, women, and children from all different backgrounds, from all different parts of the world. Post-9/11 detention of immigrants, both illegal and legal. The racial and gender dynamics of mandatory detention. That's another thing. These pieces of legislation made detention mandatory. The racial and gender dynamics of mandatory detention deserve some discussion. In the post-9/11 era, we are led to believe that the detainees are all Middle Eastern, North African, South Asian, and certainly all are terrorists who entered the country illegally. If we looked at the news, if we're dependent upon the news to get our information, I'm telling you, that's what a lot of us would walk away thinking. The truth of the matter is that the detainees include Russians, Poles, Irish, Chinese, Western Europeans, West Indians, Koreans, and some of the African detainees include people from Somalia, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and the list goes on and on. Due to legislation passed before 911, legal immigrants are detained who have been convicted of a crime, and sometimes it's a minor one. Furthermore, legal permanent residents can be detained for minor crimes committed in the past, as I said earlier. They become a part of the prison industry complex that is an extension of the government's war on drugs with societal approval to remove and to make invisible those who are a drain on and a danger to society, primarily Black and Latino men. All of these people are criminalized when they are detained in private, local, state, and federal prisons. There are approximately 250 county jails and private prison facilities nationwide. Those are a lot of jails to detain a lot of people. New detention measures after 911 allow for indefinite detention without the right to a lawyer, without the right to a public arraignment, without knowledge of what one is being accused of and what evidence is being used against the detainee. You are detained away from your family, and of course you are housed along with hardened criminals, even though you yourself have not committed a violent crime. Or it could be the situation where perhaps you have committed a violent crime, you have served your time, you have made your amends with society, you've gone on about your business, but then again, it could come back to haunt you. In other words, they are presumed guilty until proven innocent, but they're not given the opportunity or means to prove their innocence. Furthermore, they can be moved around the country without their family knowing or having access to a lawyer, let alone translators for those who do not speak English. Again, the Katrina connection is important. The largely African American, Latino, and poor victims of Hurricane Katrina were presumed guilty by the media and politicians and not given the opportunity to prove their innocence before they were shipped off to other states. In other words, get them out of New Orleans, get them out of sight, out of mind, and let them be somebody else's problem. Immigrants are criminalized when they are detained, and Katrina victims were too when they were accused of looting, killing, and raping before anybody had been arrested. The Superdome was supposed to be a haven for all types of illegal activity. They were characterized as gangbangers, drug dealers, drug users, and just downright thugs. This is merely an extension of how the African American community, Latino, and poor communities are viewed, full of violence and in need of law and order that only a militarized police state can contain, which is manifested in the prison industry complex, where African American, Latino, and poor men are disproportionately represented, with 3 strikes against them, or women who got caught up in the drug trade through no fault of their own, except that they were partners of men who were accused and convicted of being involved in the drug trade. There's a need to look at these issues in terms of economic development and social justice as more money is spent to police borders that have become increasingly more militarized, both by the government and private citizens, and to meet mandatory detentions while social services for immigrants and citizens have been cut to the bone. In addition, they are treated in a manner that reflects how the government and larger society views them. They're subjected to verbal and physical abuse, overcrowded conditions, strip searches, solitary confinement. And as you know, the solitary confinement isolates them from the larger prison population. And of course, they lack oftentimes adequate medical care, and of course, mental abuse takes place as well. All of these things, as you know, are violations of individuals' human rights. They serve their time and then they are deported. But even that doesn't always work. Some cannot even be deported because their home governments will not accept them back. Now let's go over this quickly. Perhaps you have been convicted of a crime. You've spent your time in jail. You've given up your appeals. You don't want to fight the system anymore. You are like, okay, I'm ready to be deported. But there's a glitch because your home country won't accept you. Some of those cases include China. Some of those countries include China, Mali, Somalia, Cote d'Ivoire, and others. We often think of these detainees as male, and a lot of them are, which brings up the question of what happens to women and children in their lives. Again, the need to provide a gendered analysis. When these men are detained, their spouses, partners, children, and other dependents, both here and back home, are deprived of their income, emotional support, and other resources. Sometimes they are the only ones working in the home, the only ones with a driver's license and a car, and the only one who can speak English. What happens to them, we can just about imagine. So it's a question of, it's not just what happens to the person who is detained or the person who is deported, it's what happens to that individual's family and friends, both here and abroad. Women held in detention. I do not intend to give the impression that men are the only ones who are detained. Women are as well, and they too are criminalized. And I will speak next about boys and girls who are detained. Hundreds of women refugees, undocumented immigrants, and legal residents are held in detention, and they are housed with people who have been convicted of violent and nonviolent crimes. Many of the refugee women are seeking political asylum because they have a well-founded fear of persecution. Because they are women, they have a well-founded fear of persecution. They have been raped. They fear being raped. They are running away from forcible abortions, sterilization. They are trying to escape female genital mutilation, or they do not want their daughters to undergo the procedure. They are trying to escape forced prostitution, forced marriages, and abductions. Many of them have fled from war-torn countries, and they have physical and psychological scars that will be difficult to heal while they're being held in detention under harsh conditions. The Women's Commission for Refugee Women and Children reported that women detainees face the same human rights violations while they are detained. Some of those include intrusive body searches, poor food, lack of medical care, sexual abuse, and women face this more than men because they are women. Physical assault, solitary confinement, verbal abuse, and overcrowded conditions. Women detainees are not even provided adequate sanitary supplies. This is common in refugee camps abroad, but to deny them this very basic necessity is unconscionable. They too are moved around the country and not given access to legal representation or to their families. However, men and women are treated somewhat differently. In a study done by Marlene Bastion and her study of women detainees in Florida, she reports that, quote, there is a double standard in the treatment of women and men asylum seekers. In Miami, men are housed mainly at Chrome, an open-door facility where detainees are not placed in cells or locked down. They have access to a separate cafeteria, law library, outside patio, and large recreation area, as well as better access to family visits and lawyers, end of quote. Men also have better access to translators and can work. They're working without pay, but nevertheless, that gives them something to do with their time. And the women reported that one thing that really drove them crazy and made it very unbearable to stay in detention was that they simply had nothing to do with their time. They couldn't work, they couldn't earn money, they were just there. And when they were put in solitary confinement, the whole situation was actually exacerbated. Even in detention, women are shortchanged. Furthermore, women who are detained are unable to work, to provide for their families, and to send money home. Philippa Strom provides a brief but telling summary when she writes, and I quote, "We as a nation disfavor immigrants, and among the immigrants, we value the least our women." So that's sort of a rank. You know, you can be an immigrant, you can be undocumented, you can be illegal, but even within that context, not all of them are equal. Detention of unaccompanied minors. You awake? Are some of you students and you were made to come? Because I can spot that a mile away. We're almost done. Detention of unaccompanied minors. Men and women held in detention are receiving less and less protection. But what about the children who are held? Most of us paid attention to the media frenzy over 6-year-old Elian Gonzalez a few years ago. But how many of us are aware of the hundreds of children, mainly from China, Cuba, Haiti, and Central America, who are held in detention in Mexico, who are held in detention without the necessary language and educational skills to understand the very confusing immigration process. And I'm not even talking about that they're not psychologically prepared, they're not mentally prepared, they're not emotionally prepared, because they're children. Children come to the United States for various reasons, and some are similar to those given by adults. Children, too, are escaping from being raped or the threat of being raped, female genital mutilation, forced prostitution, forced marriages. They are fleeing from civil war, famine, and economic hardships. In some, they too want to make a better life for themselves, while others come to be reunited with family members. These children also cannot depend on the federal or state governments to protect them. First, we should ask ourselves, why do we detain children who have not committed a violent crime? Whatever the answer is, this is against international law that prohibits the detention of children except as a measure of last resort. Nevertheless, hundreds of children, many of them girls, are held throughout the country in detention. Some of them are as young as 1 year old, a 1-year-old. If this is about the war on terrorism, how can a baby be a threat to the country's national security? The average age of the children detained are between the ages of 15 and 17, but of course we have some exceptions. These are children, not terrorists. When children arrive illegally with a parent or guardian, they are separated from that person and put in detention. Children who are waiting to have their asylum applications reviewed are also put in detention, although some of them have parents and legal guardians who they could stay with while they wait for their cases to be heard. Children are also housed alongside convicted felons, although they are underage. You've got convicted felons who are underage. They may be underage, but they're in detention for some pretty serious crimes, and some of those crimes include rape, selling drugs, assault, armed robbery, etc. The conditions in the detention facilities are not better for children than they are for adults. Children are not given access to legal representation and are expected to represent themselves if they can make their cases in an immigration court. Most adults can't do that. I probably couldn't represent myself in an immigration court, but to expect a child to come here to do that without all sorts of resources makes us wonder. They're not provided adequate medical and dental care, translators, or given access to their relatives. And if they are punished, for not following instructions, and often they cannot understand the instructions due to the language barrier, but yet they're punished anyway. Some of the children enter the facilities pregnant. I should say some of the female children enter the facilities pregnant, while others become pregnant during their stay. Again, somebody, of course, is getting them pregnant, but the male is not pregnant and giving birth and with this child on a day-to-day basis. And even if you are pregnant and you give birth in detention and you are a child, you and your child, you remain there in detention. These conditions have led to emotional and mental problems that in some cases have caused children to commit suicide or to clearly attempt to commit suicide. Due to the lack of facilities, some children are placed in privately run foster care facilities that are insecure and unsafe, and girls are put at risk for rape and other forms of sexual abuse. Okay. I'm going to skip a couple things. Many children who could be released to family members languish in detention facilities because the family members refuse to pick them up. Now, why are they refusing to pick them up? Because the family member herself or himself is undocumented. And if they pick the child up, then they have to report, under this new legislation, then they have to report to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Department. Again, they don't want to pick the child up because they don't want to report this because they in turn can be deported. And I'm going to move into deportation. As early as 1995, pre-911, the number of deportations began to increase. 51,000 in 1995, 70,000 in 1996, 114,000 in 1997, 193,000 in 1998, 186,000 in 2000, 148,000 in 2002, and 198,000 people were deported in 2004. Most of the deportations were for non-criminal charges. However, black immigrants are deported at higher rates than others for criminal offenses. Some of the nationalities include Jamaicans, Dominicans, and Haitians. But these populations were not implicated in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Also, black immigrants from South America, these people could be from Guyana, Colombia, and Brazil, also have high rates of deportation. They were also deported for criminal offenses, as high as 75% in 1996, which again was before 9/11. If black immigrants are deported due to criminal records, this means that they have served their time in jail and then are deported. While the criminal element within the African American community can be removed through prisons, the criminal element within the black immigrant community can further be removed permanently through deportation. Before the implementation of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, legal immigrants could only be deported if they were convicted of committing a felony. As we know, that has changed. And again, it could be for something minor. In addition, some of the deportees came to this country at a very early age. Some do not speak the language of their home countries, while others leave spouses, partners, and children here. Again, the question is, what happens to those families? And of course, as you know, if somebody is deported, those families can be permanently separated without the economic or emotional support, and again, that could be permanent. Let me move along a little bit because time is not on my side. Okay. Individuals who enter the country with the intention of applying for political asylum, and these people would be refugees, with the intention of applying for political asylum can also be detained and then deported without having their cases adjudicated under the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Clearly, this is in violation of international law and the 1951 and 1967 UN Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees that the United States signed on to. So it's signed on to these two pieces of international law, and it's violating them. And when other people violate the same thing, we're up in arms, we should do something about it, but somehow or another, we don't pay very much attention to it when we do it ourselves. The U.S. government immediately requires a would-be refugee to prove that she has a well-founded fear of persecution. If she is unable to do this, she's immediately detained and can be deported without taking into consideration that that person may have left the country in a hurry. Most people don't wake up one day and just decide that that's something they want to do. She may not have had time to collect the proper documentation, or simply she's unable to prove her case at that point. Maybe she can't articulate it. Maybe she's still traumatized. Maybe she can't do it right then and there, but it doesn't mean that she should not be given the opportunity in the future. And I'm saying she, I mean he as well. Again, people who are coming here and who want to apply for political asylum are basically made into criminals, and they too are detained, and they too can be deported. Now I'm going to get you out of my misery, your misery. I'm going to do my conclusion and open the floor up for friendly discussion. The experiences of immigration in this country in terms of housing, employment, health care, leisure outlets, and so forth are dependent on race, gender, class, and now status. For example, those immigrants who have obtained citizenship have lower rates of poverty regardless of their gender, while female children who are 18 and younger without citizenship have the highest rates of poverty. Throughout the literature, it is well documented that all immigrants who have a college degree have better opportunities in finding employment and decent housing. They can make money, they have health care, they have transportation, they have daycare for their children, and they can enjoy all types of recreational activities. It is also documented in the literature that women immigrants, the undocumented, those who do not speak English, the elderly, the physically challenged, and the unaccompanied face many challenges from how they will feed themselves and their families, on how they can avoid deportation and detention. Again, the media would have us believe that most of the immigrants coming to the United States are uneducated, unskilled, and Mexican. The reality is that a large percentage of the immigrant population is highly educated and skilled, and many of them are women. For example, there are thousands of women immigrants from all over the world who are professors, doctors, nurses, business owners, computer specialists, and so on. We all know, or we ought to know, that the African immigrant population is the most educated among the groups. Perhaps they have to be in order to gain admission. We have in our heads the stereotype of the African cab driver in most metropolitan areas, but there are thousands of African immigrants who are doctors, professors, scientists, students, business owners, so on and so forth, and they make valuable contributions throughout American society. In summary, the media and politicians have racialized immigrants in this country to be either Arab, Muslim, terrorist, or Mexican. The status of immigrants has also been racialized. If we ever hear about white immigrants, they are viewed as legal, whereas immigrants of color, especially Mexicans, are viewed as illegal. Immigrants are also gendered as male and adults. This leaves us with a very distorted picture. In reality, immigrants range from children from China and Haiti to women from Ireland and Canada to men from Poland and Germany. Within the various nationalities of immigrants, some are here legally while others are here illegally. No one group has a monopoly on legal status, nor does any one group have a monopoly on illegal status. We cannot allow the war on terrorism, that is an extension of the war on poverty and the war on drugs, to pit American citizens against both legal and illegal immigrants. And African Americans cannot afford to sit back and watch and falsely believe that for the first time they can breathe a little easier because the targets are foreign and not them. Because as we saw during the Katrina debacle, that their real claim to citizenship was tenuous at best. Thank you. Okay, I can go home. Yes. Yes.
When you were discussing the prisons where children were being detained, and you were talking about how women became occupied in the prisons, is it how are the men and women put together, or the boys and girls rather put together?
Sure, and you know what? That's a very good question, and it depends on the facility. Oftentimes you have a situation where, when it was the INS, and still now, because of overcrowding, they would contract their work out with private facilities. And of course, the INS and Homeland Security had guidelines, but there was no guarantee that those guidelines would be put in place. Girls and boys, because we're talking about the children, were supposed to be separated. But we know, and they were detained, but it didn't, again, it depends on the the facility, it didn't mean that they were locked down and could not go out. Again, it depended on the facility, where boys and girls could go to the park, they could go to the library, they could go to school. So oftentimes it was not necessarily that they were getting pregnant in these facilities, which did happen, but they could also get pregnant once they left those facilities. And again, we need to keep in mind that the facilities ranged from foster care to putting children into foster care in private homes, and without monitoring, you didn't know who these people were, what they were about. So again, there were a number of ways in which they could get pregnant.
Many of the immigrants and refugees that come here legally and or illegally, especially those that are fleeing political persecution, have come from political contexts in which they have, let's just say, a higher level of political consciousness than maybe the average American citizen who has been documented internationally to have a lower level of sort of structural analysis. Do you think there is a relationship, and we've seen a lot of immigrant communities in LA, for example, from Salvador, Guatemala, who have reinvigorated the union movement, who have been leaders in community organizing in these communities. Do you think there's any relationship between the activism and the fear of activism from many of the political and economic refugees and immigrants? Do you think that's behind some of this? And could you just talk a little bit?
Oh, sure. I definitely think so. I think you've got two groups, if you will. There are a number of people who have retreated. And a lot of those people are undocumented. They are here, quote unquote, illegally. And they have retreated because they're out not afraid. But within that same category, we saw hundreds of people who took to the streets in terms of just going out there saying that what you're doing is wrong. The flip side is that even legal immigrants have really been in the forefront because they're residents. Whether they're legal or illegal, people know when something is wrong. People know that when the media and politicians are taking advantage of a situation. People know that when they're being scapegoated. And there are a number of instances where absolutely communities have built coalitions, they've come together, and they've really been in the forefront for bringing about awareness, to make changes in these policies and whatnot. And I agree absolutely that whether you're looking at Los Angeles or Washington or other communities, people have come together and really been in the forefront, and sort of like there's a new energy. Absolutely. That is positive. And I would also like to think that African Americans will join, if they have not already joined, and look at things that any of these groups have in common as opposed to the differences. And not be pitted one against the other, but to figure out ways in which they can build viable, strong coalitions. Dr. Dow.
Oh, now I'm feeling all funny. Okay. How much of the detention centers are also just big business for the United States? Because I'm thinking about the York prison. When they switched over, they were waning prison, and then all of a sudden they started catering the INS. And they're filled to capacity. And how does that compare to other Western countries that are taking in, let's say, asylum seekers, and how are they? I don't even think they're detained, are they? Or are they, like I'm thinking of Canada most specifically.
Yeah, not like here.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. Of course, I didn't get a chance to get into it during the lecture. Doing the research for this presentation, I was absolutely positively amazed at the amount of money that these detention facilities have been providing for state and local communities, in the sense that I can't remember the state, but there was one example when the locality was making so much money from the detention facilities that they could really greatly reduce their taxes. This is an industry. You have communities that are welcoming these detention facilities because they can get on average $60, $75 per prisoner per day. So this is a for-profit money-making entity. And it's almost as if, again, it's coinciding with the increase in the prison industry complex anyway, due to the war on drugs, due to all sorts of things, that's just really moving right on in to this area of detaining people. Now, I'll be honest with you, I cannot speak about other countries because I was just looking at the United States. But clearly, this is a money-making entity. And people are jumping on board like you would not believe. And at the same time, you know, these localities are getting more and more money as a result of detaining people, but yet you have less and less money for basic things that I was talking about, not just for refugees, not just for immigrants, but for American citizens as well. So you have to ask yourself, where is this money going? Who is really benefiting from this money? But all sorts of private arrangements, absolutely. And, you know, it's a group, it's a club, and they give each other these contracts, and they're greasing each other's palms, if you will. Phil?
I actually pretty loud. Everybody hear me? Okay.
We'll talk into the mic anyway. Something that was striking me as you mentioned the date of the, Ken, if I get the name of it right, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Okay. Kept coming back to 1994, and I'm thinking about the Predicate Immigration Act and its repeal in the 1964 and then again in 1965. I'm wondering if you've plotted the relative success politically for certain parties in response to this, because 94 is the same time as the Contract for America, right? And so we see the coming together of the fence at the same time as we're seeing the sort of the fervor around gay marriage, as these are new, what seemed to me as new planks in the Republican platform. But if it's going back to 94 and we're seeing it again in 64 and 65, I'm just wondering if you've plotted this sort of thing, I mean, through the latter part of the past century, and how much you see this as part of a plank of a new conservatism.
I have to tell you all that you all are really guinea pigs. I hadn't decided if this was going to be the beginning of a new research agenda. So what you asked, I have not looked at. But when I was preparing for this presentation, I was struck by the intersection of the welfare reform. I was struck by because oftentimes, again, we're thinking of the war on terrorism as being post-9/11, but if you look at 1994, if you look at 1996, if you look at things under a so-called liberal, and he was liberal only to some people, under Clinton, you have to ask yourself, you know, what was underlying this? And I think so much came together that it would be something that clearly, if I was going to let this be a larger research project, I would have to look into, that I've not looked into at all. But, you know, both parties are sort of straddling the fence, if you will, trying not to come out too far this way, trying not to come out too far that way. But that's an interesting question. I'll look into it. Yes.
If a woman, while detained and was pregnant, if she had her child in the detention center, would that child be deemed a U.S. citizen?
By law, if you will, the child would be considered a U.S. citizen because the child was born in the United States. And you know, you've got many examples where women and men have been deported, and of course they have a child who is an American citizen by birth. And of course the parent is caught in the middle. The parents, of course, want to be with the child, but yet they can't remain in the country because they're here illegally. And of course, if they go back home, well, why did they come to this country? They came for all sorts of reasons. And if they go back home, well, they have to go back home. But if they have to be deported and take the child with them, of course, oftentimes they're thinking that they're depriving the child of the very thing that they came here for and that they want the child to benefit from: education, health care, citizenship, things of that nature. But yes, the child is considered an American citizen. Yes.
just to follow up on that question, I've noticed a lot of discussion in the press about women who come here, particularly the press has targeted Mexican women who come here and have bear a child on American soil, and they've been referring to those children as anchor babies. And there's been a recent conservative attack on native-born children and to deny citizenship to those children. And I'm just curious as to why do you think it is that women who come here from Mexico to seek a better life for their children are villainized and are criticized as trying to get anchor babies, whereas women who come from other countries seeking opportunity. And I'm really struck by some political ads that I've seen as of late that say, oh, when my ancestors came here, they came here seeking opportunity, but now we've got people coming here for more sinister reasons. And I think, when did people who are, in my opinion, seeking the same opportunities become sinister?
Oh, boy. I can't say I have the answer for you. I'll just tell you what I think. Again, we are seeing how immigrants clearly are racialized, particularly when we're talking about immigrants from Mexico, in ways that we don't necessarily see for even immigrants who come from Africa or other parts of the world. It's almost as if they are, and it's almost as if maybe, I don't have the answer, that they're racialized in such a way because they are so close to us, because the border is right there. Perhaps the answer is rooted in the history that we have with Mexico and Mexicans. We know that people who were even in this country after the Mexican-American War were supposed to be Mexican Americans, but they were denied citizenship through a treaty. We know that there were lots of people of Mexican descent in Arizona, in Colorado, in California, etc. They're just that. They're of Mexican descent. They are Mexican Americans. Their roots go back. They are just as an American as anybody else. But we've seen throughout history how those people were treated. We, of course, saw it during the Depression, where there was a concerted effort to round up people of Mexican descent who were citizens, to round them up and deport them. We also saw this in the 1950s with various programs that would, of course, include Operation Wetback, that again rounded up people who were Mexican citizens and sent them back. Again, I don't have the answer, but I am convinced, as I think you are, there is something about people from Mexico and how they historically have been racialized and how they continue to be racialized. And it's almost as if because they are so geographically close, we have to hold them at bay. And if we let, any little crack in the fence, that somehow or another they're going to take over and run us over as a country, and we'll never be the same. So I really don't have a definitive answer for you, but I think it's very important that we understand historically our connection, because they were clearly racialized in terms of being the other, in terms of being savage and not citizens and things of that nature. And that really, that has stuck in people's minds, and that those stereotypes, that social construction of race, if you will, really has not deviated that much. Again, even for people who were born here, who've been here for years. Can I go to her because you've answered the question before? You asked the question before. Okay.
This is another food for thought question on the theme of social justice. I've been amazed at how many people I would consider generally apprised of his history and the politics of the period are influenced by the argument that you hear in the media over and over again, that there's something unfair about the immigrant who comes here illegally, who is taking the place of someone who's playing by the rules. And it seems to me that this whole construct is making a tremendous impact that I wouldn't have otherwise expected, and it must come up in some of your thoughts on the whole issue of legal and illegal immigration. And what would you say to the power of this argument and how one can begin to address it?
Again, I can't say I have a definite answer, but as someone said, when you are looking at these political ads, I mean, it's very obvious that these distinctions are again made between who's here illegally, who deserves to be here, and who's here illegally. And again, you never see even the thought of somebody who could be white or of European descent who's in the country illegally. Again, it's always as if illegal immigrants are not just racialized, but they're really Mexican. And they're leaving out, and I'm not just talking about, white immigrants. I'm talking about immigrants from all over. And I don't know what it will take for people to get away from that belief that Mexicans are illegal and everybody else could be legal. And again, we don't see the thousands of white immigrants who come legally, but just they want to work, they want to stay, their visas have been expired. Or other people as well who are here on student visas, tourist visas, etc. They overstay their visas, and that makes them illegal. So who's to say that they are deserving to stay? They may have come in legally, but if they overstay their visas, then they become illegal. And therefore, if you're going to use the same argument, they too should not be allowed to stay here. But again, we don't see that anywhere. And back with what you were saying, Phil, this whole notion of using people for a political platform, using people for the political agenda. It's very important that we as Americans and students and whatnot, that we call the media on this. When we see ads like that, when we hear stories like that, we have to begin this process of thinking, that's not correct. And again, we have to just rethink who is an immigrant, who is legal, who's illegal, and again, get away from thinking that they all are illegal and they all are here from Mexico. And they're not taking people's jobs away from them, and they're not killing and looting and things of that nature. That even most quote-unquote illegal immigrants are law-abiding citizens. And it's almost as if they certainly have to be, because if they break the law, we know what's going to happen to them.
In your opinion, what do you think is the reason for the sudden attention given to illegal immigration? Because from my understanding, I personally don't see a problem with immigration, or certainly not a sudden problem that's existed as something different. I don't think there is any staggering increase in immigration in any way, especially from Mexico. And it just seems very strange to me why there's a sort of sudden media attention and such a recent focus on illegal immigration when there's no new problem, and in my mind no problem at all. But if there is a problem, why is it any different, and why is it now an issue? And what in your opinion is the issue, or do people find a reason to focus on this?
Some people would clearly make the argument that there's not a problem. Other people, as you know, would make an argument that it's a huge problem. It's an enormous problem. Again, it's almost as if we're being taken over by these immigrants and they are all illegal. Clearly, in my opinion, I think the issues of immigration, I think they ebb and flow. I think they come and go. If you look at any type of immigration legislation, of course, the media is going to pay attention, politicians are going to pay attention, and then all of a sudden we think of it as a huge issue. And of course, I don't even know if you were born in 1980, but of course I was around, and I remember the Refugee Act, and of course I was around in 1986 with the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Again, people were up in arms because, again, it had an amnesty program that would allow people who had come to this country and they were undocumented, the legislation would allow them to adjust their status. Again, the question was, well, they came into the country illegally. They are undocumented. Why should this amnesty program benefit them and they can then become legal? I think part of it has to do with economic conditions internally, economic conditions externally. I think the media has a large role to play, because if we see it over and over again, they put it on that agenda, they are the gatekeepers, and then all of a sudden, if we see it over and over again, we think, oh, it's important. It's important, and we ought to pay attention. Of course, both political parties are important in terms of getting us to think what's important, getting us to think what we ought to act on. So again, economic crises or economic factors clearly play in domestically and internationally. With the terrorist attacks of 9/11, of course, immigration was going to be an issue because, of course, we know that the people had come into the country in student visas, things of that nature. So again, I think it's a combination of factors. And I think a lot of people aren't necessarily concerned, but we are almost inundated daily, weekly, nightly with this issue of not just immigration. And that's the other thing. If it were framed as immigration, but it's not, it's framed as illegal immigration, what automatically sells newspapers and it will make people tune in. So I find it very interesting that you said you don't think it's an issue. New person? Yes.
I'm so fascinated with your argument about the war on terror being an extension of the war on poverty and drugs, so I'm having trouble articulating questions, but if I didn't have this microphone, it would be easier to say dumb things. The first question, however, is, you're not arguing, I mean, hasn't immigration always been racialized?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, okay.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
I think I mentioned it.
Okay, I came in late, so I may have mentioned that. So that's not something new. Then the second question has to do with how you think of the way in which we're thinking of people from Arab descent specifically. Because, I mean, clearly it's not only since 9/11, it's since the early 90s.
Right.
I mean, since the end of the Cold War, in fact, they've been framed as enemies of America. And yet they're never really framed as a group that comes to mind. Drugs, war on drugs, but definitely not in terms of poverty. I mean, so, that doesn't sort of contest your argument. It's just how one would think of. I'm really trying to work this out because it does seem since the end of the Cold War and the Russians are no longer the easy enemy, that there's been a framing. I mean, that True Lies. This, that Arnold Schwarzenegger was like fighting them in the early 90s, well before 9/11. So that somehow there was, on the part of the media at least, a conscious framing of that group as an enemy of America. And there's certainly, I mean, the first group that comes to mind in terms of profiling of who doesn't belong. And yet they don't fit the other kinds of wars. They don't fit as well the war on drugs. They certainly don't fit the war on poverty. Sort of thing.
Okay. And again, I'm working through these issues as well, so I can't say that I've gotten everything worked out. What I was trying to bring out is that there is an intersection between the war on poverty, the war on drugs, and the war on terrorism in terms of people of color. That at one point, because we thought of the new war on poverty, right? And I'm not saying it's correct, but that's how it was characterized in the media, that we're going to get these black women off of welfare. Now, we know good and well most of the people on welfare were white women. But again, it was characterized that way as the new war on poverty that was targeted towards African American women, Latina women. That's one war. Then if you look at the war on drugs, of course, oftentimes we think of African American men who, of course, were put in prison. Then when we think about the war on terrorism, again, we think of men in particular from South Asia, from the Middle East, from North Africa. Again, a racial, gendered thing. But the point I was trying to make is that all of these people who we think of who were affected by any of these wars were people of color. But that didn't necessarily mean that the only people who were affected were people of color. And I was trying to make the argument that when we look at issues of immigration and we look at issues of refugees and whatnot, that instead of pitting these communities against each other by saying this group is this group is that actually they have more in common. That for whatever reason, all of these communities have been affected either together or separately by the new war on poverty, the war on terrorism, and the war on drugs. And that when you look at people who are othered, who are criminalized, who are isolated, who are detained, who are marginalized, put them away, lock them up, get them out of sight. We're seeing a common thread, I would argue, with these groups. Okay.
Yeah, that's a question.
This is the last one.
That's it. Go ahead.
Is it on? Okay. I guess I've been thinking through the crossings that you've mentioned, and I sort of tried to flip it on a way of, if we think of historically, I've been thinking of the concepts of ownership and property, and how, and you mentioned earlier on how property and the rights to vote and representation was only extended to white males who owned land and owned property. And I think that's still the situation that we're dealing with in many ways, in that there's been a battle over who has property and who has, and then thus property extending these rights in a way. And that we saw that after the Civil War, even though the right to vote was extended, right to own property was not. And it was a way of disenfranchising those who would even be able to then vote. And how we see this as going as a battle that goes back and forth, and how in the early 1900s, the race situation that came to challenge white landowners in the early part of the century, since they had effectively through Jim Crow disenfranchised African Americans, was to section off non-Anglo-Saxon German whites and exclude them from equal rights in terms of race divisions within white communities. And I guess I see like what you're suggesting that's going on is, do we see after the civil rights movement of the 1960s sort of a calculated disenfranchisement of different groups in order to maintain property and therefore right to vote, right to health care, right to everything in the United States, by disenfranchising both African American Latino women through the war on poverty, disenfranchising African American or Black American born men through the war on drugs, and then this war on terror being another step of disenfranchisement, since we have educated immigrants coming to the United States that would be a threat to white supremacy, white male patriarch supremacy, and that this being another step as a way to deter these educated immigrants from coming in and possibly disrupting the power structure.
Wow. That's a very interesting way to put it, and I haven't thought about it that way. But, let me just start with African Americans real briefly. That's a very interesting point, because oftentimes we think that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was it that allowed them to have the right to vote. But I take your point. We know good and well that once you serve time in jail, and a lot of times the people who have served the time in jail were African American men, and depending on what states they were in, they lost their right to vote. And when we look at those particular states, we see that those were Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, sort of like an extension of black codes, Jim Crow type thing. So that's a very interesting point, and I do take that. The other thing is that, and we do see the civil rights movement as allowing African Americans and other people of color that it allowed them to make all these economic, social, and political and educational gains. But in reality, it's almost as if we can look at these as gains, but we know good and well that there's segments of each of those populations that really didn't make so many gains. And of course, part of that clearly is property. And if we want to just look at property in terms of just land, we know good and well that there were thousands of African Americans in the South in particular who lost their land for whatever reason. They couldn't pay the taxes and things of that nature. And once that land is lost, it is lost. We're also seeing lots of African American communities in urban areas where, unfortunately, when the 1980s and the 1990s came, in terms of the crack thing, and property values were going up, and people were shut out of their homes and whatnot, couldn't pay the taxes, people died, they lost their property. So I agree with you. I think, and again, I haven't thought it out, but you've given me something to think about, that you're seeing issues of property in terms of just pushing people out of urban areas, pushing them into suburbs that they can't afford, raising the property taxes, people losing land, businesses, etc. So that I'm going to give it some more thought. I will. Am I off the hot seat?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to lever over a hand